Beste mensen, heel hartelijk welkom bij de 7e Vrijzinnige Lezing. De Vrijzinnige Lezing van dit jaar 2024. En ik ga over in het Engels. It is my honor to introduce Professor Jayne Svenungsson from Lund to you tonight. Professor Svenungsson holds the chair in systematic theology, and she published and edited or co-edited many books and wrote even more articles. Her outstanding academic career got shape in Gothenburg, where she studied, led her via Stockholm, a school of theology, where she taught to Lund University. She was visiting fellow or visiting professor in Heidelberg, Paris, Oxford and Munich. And she was awarded with the Per Beskov Prize for contributing to the dialogue between theology, society and culture in the public sphere in 2014, and the Karin Gierhoff Prize, awarded by the Swedish Academy for contributions to the dissemination of building in 2015. She even was a member of the Swedish Academy herself, that is the select company awarding the Nobel Prize in Literature. And I quote the way she introduces herself on her website. Already in my undergraduate studies, I combined studies in theology, philosophy, and history. In recent years, the focus of my research has been on philosophy of history and political theology, including the ways in which apocalyptic and messianic motives play out in modern Western philosophy and political thinking. And in my own words, I would like to add that Jayne Svenungsson's work seems to me to be of great importance for a liberal theology today. Svenungsson highlights the role that religion still has in society today, which can be a problematic role, and she points out the importance that the Bible can still have for our time. With her broad-based view of culture, she gives liberal theology food for thought and self-criticism. She points out blind spots and potentially oppressive views to which a humanized Christianity can give rise, and thereby helps a theology that wants to be culturally oriented to stay up to date. And we are eager to hear her lecture tonight, that is entitled Poetic Theology, Retrieving the Radical Impulse of Aesthetic Protestantism. And please give a warm welcome to Jayne Svenungsson.
Thank you, Rick, for these kind and welcoming words. It's a true honor to be here, and so also thank you, more general, for this wonderful invitation. I've been looking forward for a very long time to this evening. So, Poetic Theology, Retrieving the Radical Impulse of Aesthetic Protestantism, is what I choose as title. 25 years ago, at the turn of the millennium, the Swedish Lutheran Church was separated from the state after an almost 500-year-long symbiosis. There's actually my childhood church. Was this a moment when Swedes would turn their back on church for good? Now, if anyone held such aspirations, reality has shown itself to be more complex. To be sure, Sweden, like most Western European countries, displays a typical pattern of secularization in the sense that there has been a slow but steady decline in church affiliation and attendance since World War II. Yet the fact that the church was separated from the state didn't change things dramatically. Today, almost 2 or even over 2 decades later, more than half of the Swedish population are still members of the church. And although there has been rightful disappointment when moral misconduct of particular representatives of the Church has been revealed, people generally hold the Church in high esteem, especially its social and diaconal work. Moreover, while attendance in regular church services continue to fall, people still turn up in large numbers during the festive periods or when the great works of sacred music are performed. Sometimes these tendencies are described as an expression of the individualist and consumerist mentality of contemporary Europeans. People show up in church when it suits their needs and interests. But what about this is not the entire picture? What about if there is a deeper complexity hidden in these patterns? Some decades ago, just as the Church was preparing for the separation from the state, the late novelist and member of the Swedish Academy, Birgitta Trotzig, made a thought-provoking comment on this discrepancy between people's attendance in regular services and their turnout at concerts of sacred music. And this is what she said. There is an enormous hunger for truly religious forms, that is, for ritual and liturgical expressions. It is empowering when the rite consists of a citizen giving practical advice from the pulpit. But when it comes to Bach, even the largest cathedrals are filled, which is by no means a matter of aestheticism, but testifies rather to a sense of a very broad audience for what the sacred really is. And I shall give you a few seconds to reread these lines because I shall come back to them throughout my lecture. Now, this comment, which was made in an interview in Sweden's main daily, Dagens Nyheter, has remained with me ever since I was a doctoral student back in the 1990s. Not only because of Trotzig's witty way of suggesting that the standard sermon often leaves a lot more to desire, but also because of her intriguing comment that people's attraction to Bach may in fact say something about what the sacred really is. Many years later, when I took up my current position at Lund University in 2015, Trotzig's words inspired me to initiate a research project on the affinities between spiritual and aesthetic experiences, together with a colleague in art history. The project ran over several years, during which we organized concerts, poetry readings, art exhibitions, and dance performances, always accompanied by public conversations between representatives of different artistic fields and different religious denominations. The response was overwhelming, both in terms of the number of people who turned up and in terms of oral and written feedback. Among these feedbacks, I'd like to share a few paragraphs from a beautifully handwritten letter I received after having published an essay about our project in the newspaper. The letter was written by an elderly lady named Agneta. Dear Professor Jayne, she wrote, we always use first names in Sweden. I want to thank you for your fine and interesting essay about God and the beautiful arts. It is high time that someone addresses the possibility of God's wondrous presence in the human capacity of sensuous perception. I once stood before the Mona Lisa in the Louvre, and soon I felt that I was lifted up, filled with rapture as if from God. But it also, sometimes when I hear music by Mozart or Beethoven, that happens too. But it also happens that I get lifted up by modern singers. For example, by Elvis Presley the other day in a television documentary, or Leonard Cohen, the soul singers. These things never come to pass in church, and I don't go to church any longer. It is embarrassing or even painful to listen to the trivial sermons which almost always lacks any spiritual content. Some everyday talk is what is offered. My partner and I have been to several churches over the years, and it is always the same thing. It's such a pity, because humans need God in each and every way. They need the living water, just like flowers need water. And that was the end of it. Now, this touching letter brings me to the topic of this lecture and what will be my contribution to our joint task of rethinking and developing the liberal theological legacy. The core of my argument, more precisely, will be that we need to take testimonies like these utterly seriously. Not because they represent a widespread sense among people today, although they probably do, and not because they suggest that churches ought to adapt themselves to an increasingly secular world by offering concerts instead of services in a sort of defeatist mood, like if people don't want God, at least we could give them Bach. No, in contrast to such defeatism, and in keeping with Birgitta Trotzig, I will instead argue that there is something much more profound going on here, something which has to do with our immense complexity as human beings, including our capacity to feel awe and wonder. Many early Protestant theologians understood this much better than we do today. This is especially the case with pietist and romantic forms of Protestantism, where we find an advanced reflection on the richness of the human capacity for wonder and its relation to God's unfathomable reality. When I speak of a lost radical impulse of aesthetic Protestantism in the title of this lecture, this is what I have in mind. I will therefore start out by revisiting this early phase in Protestantism, which more precisely will take us to the city of Halle in Germany in the 18th century. From there on, I will continue to a key figure in the liberal theological tradition, Friedrich Schleiermacher, although I am less interested in the standard image of Schleiermacher as the father of modern theology, and more interested in the way in which he seizes upon the radical impulse of aesthetic theology. Finally, I shall explore what retrieving this impulse would entail for contemporary theology and church life. For, like Agneta in her letter, I believe that it is high time that we start readdressing the possibility of God's wondrous presence in the human capacity of sensuous perception. Now, in the liberal theological tradition, the category of experience has always been central. Yet this is a category yet it is also a category that has been at the center of the criticism that liberal theology has attracted over the past 100 years. From Karl Barth to George Lindbeck, liberal theology has been reproached for reducing revelation to experience and thus for making theology vulnerable to the arbitrariness of the human mind in its present cultural state. From the 1960s onwards, the category of experience has also been criticized by post-structuralist and post-colonial thinkers who have pointed to the cultural, sexist and racist assumptions that implicitly govern discourses based on the notion of universal human experiences. Now, these waves of particularizing critique have been crucial for the refinement of liberal theology as well as of Western philosophical thinking in general. At the same time, there is reason today to reflect on the flip side of decades of academic theorizing that places too much emphasis on cultural and racial difference at the cost of the predicaments that binds humans together. This is especially the case in light of recent years' growing nationalist movements, whose actors deliberately draw on a rhetoric of identity and difference with a view to reinforcing their vision of a cultural order based on antagonistic separation of people and races. Now, while maintaining the significance of critical race and gender perspectives, I nonetheless want to claim that one of the great challenges of our time, perhaps the great challenge, is to re-articulate the idea of a shared world, including the claim that there are fundamental human experiences that are recognizable across cultural and linguistic boundaries. This is one of many reasons why it makes sense to go back to early Protestantism, where we find an exceedingly rich reflection on human experience. Indeed, as a Lutheran, it is tempting to say that theology as such is necessarily about experience, as Luther himself famously defined theology as sapientia experimentalis, a knowing that comes by experience. In praising the agonizing struggle with the Word of God as a vital source of wisdom, Luther shifted focus away from a scholastic idea of theology as guided by concepts towards an understanding of theology as learning that takes place within history and experience. This shift indicates not only a growing sense for the importance of language and temporality to the knowledge of God, but also an awareness that the human faculty of knowing is richer than merely the capacity to know in a logical or propositional sense. If Luther's idea of theology as a knowing that comes by experience can be seen as a reaction against the too scholastic or rationalist form of theology, not all Lutherans would heed Luther on this point. On the contrary, prompted by the new scientific and intellectual ideals of the early modern era, much of Lutheran theology took a decisively rationalist turn. Especially during the 17th century, with the emergence of so-called Lutheran orthodoxy, focus was increasingly placed on the cognitive and doctrinal aspects of the Christian teaching. Still today, Lutheran Christianity is often thought of as bookish, intellectualist, and disembodied, much like the standard image of Reformed Christianity, which is often thought of as Puritan and hostile towards sensuous expressions. But there were other strands of Protestant theology, early Protestant theology, strands where Luther's rich theological anthropology was not abandoned, but instead developed and refined. Nowhere is this better exemplified than in the city of Halle, which during the early 18th century became an important hub for pietist theology, centered around the figure of August Hermann Francke. Apart from being a brilliant and innovative theologian, Francke was also a great philanthropist. The building you can see here on the image is the famous orphanage Francke founded in the wake of the plague that ravaged Halle in the late 17th century and which is still there to be seen today. Now, if any of you have been there, you will know that this is a gigantic building complex, which also, in Francke's time, included schools, a library, a printing house, a pharmacy, a laboratory, an infirmary, and a huge cabinet of curiosity, which you could see a glimpse of already on an earlier slide. Now, why do I pay attention to this? Well, first of all, because it reminds us that early pietism was a distinctly intellectual culture. Now, posterity has often associated pietism with emotional enthusiasm and contempt for education. This has, in fact, little to do with historical reality. You can see their library here. Second, Francke's orphanage is fascinating because of the rich and holistic theological anthropology on which it relied. Without idealizing or smoothing over that, for example, corporeal punishment occurred, Francke's institution was guided by a pedagogical vision that involved both the senses and the intellect. In addition to traditional book learning, great value was also placed on the experience of objects in their full material vividness, where the steadily growing cabinet of curiosities, or Naturalienkammer in German, played a central role. And already by the 1730s, they had gathered over 4,000 rare natural objects. And you, of course, see another glimpse of it here on this slide. Now, although the term sacramental is rarely used in this Protestant context, it is clear that the theologians of Halle saw the experience of these amazing objects of nature as part of the spiritual practice of sensing God's wondrous presence in this created world. Overall, it is important to stress how cognitive, sensual, and spiritual practices went hand in hand in Francke's theological pedagogy. This is evident, for example, in various exercises in how to read and reflect on the Bible in the presence of the Holy Spirit. In these exercises, the affections were given a central role. Echoing Luther's idea of theologia sapientia experimentalis, Francke contended that it was the believer's felt experience of God's presence that gave life to the sacred text, just as the text in turn aroused feelings of love for God and the neighbor. All of this would be essential to the person who would become the single most famous pupil of the institution, Alexander Gottlieb Baumgarten, who hailed from a family of pietist pastors and who was sent to the orphanage in 1727 after having lost both his parents. Now, to most of you, Baumgarten, if you are familiar with this name, is probably associated with the term aesthetics, the philosophy of beauty and artistic taste. This is not at all far-fetched. Baumgarten was indeed the one who coined the term aesthetica as the name for a new way of reflecting on beauty, and is often named as the founder of modern aesthetics. Now, what I want to draw attention to here, however, is how aesthetics in this early phase was intertwined with and even grew out of pietism, and in many ways shared its concern to safeguard the affective and sensual aspect of our interaction with the world. Again, we should remind ourselves that this was a time in history when new ideals for science knowledge emerged. With thinkers such as Descartes and Leibniz, the view was established that scientifically valid knowledge required a process of abstraction away from concrete experience into clear and distinct rational ideas. Baumgarten, for his part, was well acquainted with these rationalist discourses and largely embraced their ideals as far as they concerned precisely scientific knowledge. But science is not the only way in which we as humans interact with the world. If these ideals of conceptual abstraction were opposite to scientific knowledge, Baumgarten simultaneously saw them as insufficient when dealing with other domains of human creativity, notably poetry, but also music and art. refining the complex experience involved in poetry into clear and distinct representations would simply be to deprive the poetic expression of the very richness that defined it. Now, I presume most of you can recognize this if you have ever been to an overwhelming concert or art exhibition or poetry reading and then try to describe it to someone who was not there. You can, of course, use words such as amazing, fantastic, or overwhelming to give a sense of the experience you've just had. But you will still find that these words are never able to capture the fullness of the original experience. Now, what makes Baumgarten such a fascinating thinker is that he wished to safeguard the unique character of the kind of knowledge that we acquire through poetic experiences, not as an incomplete form of scientific knowledge in need of further refinement, but as a kind of knowledge in its own right, a knowledge which is engendered by the affective rather than analytical dimensions of ourselves, and which he referred to as cognitio sensitiva, a sensate or sensual form of cognition. So in a time of growing epistemological reductionism, Baumgarten thus wanted to point to the complexity of the multifarious ways in which we interact with the world. What is of particular interest from our point of view is the rediscovery of the extent to which Baumgarten's appreciation of the sensuous dimension of our interaction with the world was rooted in a broader Lutheran pietist theological anthropology. Although he never elaborated on the theological dimensions of the experiencing self, Baumgarten developed and refined the specific strand of Protestant anthropology which he had received from his pietist upbringing. A few decades later, with the emerging Romantic movement, this strand would be further elaborated, notably in the theological anthropology of Friedrich Schleiermacher, which moves us to the second part. In the late 18th century, established Christianity suffered from a severe loss of confidence within parts of the educated segments of Europe. As I've already mentioned several times, the emerging sciences had brought new epistemological ideals to the fore, which had made their imprint also on the broader intellectual climate. This was especially the case in France, where the new rationalist ideals were explicitly turned against religion, and the Enlightenment took a decisively anti-clerical turn. In Germany, the situation was slightly different. Horrified by the excessive violence of the French Revolution, German thinkers of the Enlightenment had a more conciliatory attitude towards religion. This is especially true of the small circle of young scholars and writers who, during the last years of the 1790s, were concentrated to Jena and Berlin and are usually associated with the term Früh Romantik or early Romanticism. Now, to be sure, the early Romantics had a rather strained relation to established Christianity, which they perceived as soulless and dogmatic. In this and several other respects, they were clearly children of the Enlightenment. But unlike some of the front figures of the French Enlightenment, they were not ready to sacrifice religion as such. Instead, they cultivated the idea of a poetically refined religion that did not anxiously cling fast to dogma and literalism. This was the particular milieu in which the young theologian and pastor Friedrich Schleiermacher first formulated his original ideas on the nature of religion. Schleiermacher had become part of the Jena circle after becoming friendly with Friedrich Schleiermacher in the saloons of Berlin towards the end of summer 1797. At that time, he was working as a chaplain at La Charité, a hospital for invalids. The hospital is still there today, as you may know. Unlike the other prominent figures of the Romantic circle, he was thus firmly rooted in the practical and material reality of religion. Perhaps this explains why his own endeavor to get to the bottom of religion was not just a literary experiment or a general revolt against clerical rigidity. Schleiermacher was well acquainted with the critique of religion that flourished in the enlightened saloons, and he did not deny that it was partly justified. And yet he was sufficiently entrenched in everyday diaconal life to see where and when the critics, including his own friends in the Jena circle, were quite simply missing the target. It is against the background of this complexity that Schleiermacher set out in the winter of 1799 to write his classic to be on religion, Speeches to its Cultured Despisers, which was published anonymously half a year later. As the subtitle indicates, Schleiermacher's endeavor was to rethink religion across dominating definitions and offer a fresh understanding of the nature of religion. So what is religion all about then? Schleiermacher's famous answer is that the essence of religion is neither thinking nor acting, but intuition and feeling. With this dense phrase, he suggests three things. First, that religion is not about providing theoretical information about the nature of reality. Religion does not wish to determine and explain the universe according to its nature, as does metaphysics, he writes. Second, he suggests that religion should not be confounded with morals. A ruse of this kind, he contends, will only increase the contempt for religion further, not least since there are ample evidence that moral behavior does not follow automatically from religious conviction. To the contrary, as Schleiermacher phrases it, there are quite a few ugly, immoral blemishes on religion's history. Thirdly, and most importantly, he gives us a hint of where we should look if we want to understand religion's essence, namely in a region of human experience that precedes both reflective cognition and conscious action. It is in this unique dimension that Schleiermacher seeks to Schleiermacher seeks to capture with the terms intuition and feeling, and which he spells out a few paragraphs later in the equally well-known suggestion that religion is the sensibility and taste for the infinite. So if thought falls within the domain of knowledge and action within the domain of morality, it seems that Schleiermacher thought of our predisposition towards religion more in terms of taste and of being attuned to the infinite or the unfathomable. In other words, religion, according to this view, seems to have more to do with the realm of aesthetics, and we may recall here Baumgarten's notion of cognitio sensitiva, an intuitive kind of knowledge which is engendered by the affective rather than analytical dimensions of ourselves. Is Schleiermacher thereby simply reducing religion to art, is Schleiermacher thereby simply reducing religion to art by suggesting that people's experiences of the divine is nothing more and nothing less than an aesthetic experience? Over centuries, Schleiermacher has often been reproached for doing so, for example by the already mentioned theologian George Lindbeck, who accused him of boiling down Christian doctrines to, I quote, inner feelings, attitudes, or existential orientations of the individual. As I mentioned earlier, The accusation of being centered on human experience as the cost of divine revelation has also been a recurring feature in the more general critique against the liberal theological legacy. Now, before moving on to our own time and the value of this legacy today, let us therefore go back and look closer at what Schleiermacher actually said about the relation between religion and art and between spiritual and religious experiences. A good starting point is the concept of Kunstreligion, or a religion of art, which Schleiermacher coins in his speeches and which would become an important concept in later Romantic thought. In fact, Schleiermacher only uses the term on one occasion, namely in a brief statement in the third speech, which reads, "I have never heard anything about a religion of art that has dominated all peoples and all ages." From the context, it is clear that Schleiermacher saw the cross-fertilization between religion and art as something that existed in embryonic form in the history of religion, but whose full expression so far remained an unrealized potential. But even if this potential were to be realized, Schleiermacher still did not envisage a complete fusion between the two domains. Instead, he writes, "Religion and art stand beside one another like two friendly souls whose inner affinity, whether or not they equally surmise it, is nevertheless still unknown to them." Now, if we can conclude from these passages that Schleiermacher did not want to reduce religion to art or vice versa, he nonetheless did recognize a certain affinity between artistic sensibility and the predisposition that makes us receptive to religion. In the sentence preceding his statement that he has never heard about a religion of art, he states that if it is true that there are quick conversions, occasions by which the sense of the universe opens up in a moment, as if through an immediate inner illumination, and surprises a person with its splendor, then I believe that more than anything else, the sight of great and sublime works of art can achieve this miracle. Now, rather than equating religion with art, Schleiermacher is using the reference to art in an analogous and pedagogical way. While the cultured despisers like to think of religion as a set of irrational truth claims about reality, Schleiermacher wishes to show that being religious is more like being capable of appreciating the splendor of an artistic masterpiece. Both instances involve our sense for awe and wonder, our capacity to rise above our individual selves and relate to a larger whole. I want to stress the words larger whole here, because contrary to what has often been claimed by Lindbeck and others, Schleiermacher was anything but an individualist who sought to boil down the transcendent reality to the inner feelings of the subject. When he uses the terms feeling and intuition to capture religion's essence, these should not be understood as subjectivist categories. Rather, they serve to capture the activity at the fringes of the self, the complex interaction between the self and the unfathomable reality in which the self is embedded, which for Schleiermacher always amounts to God as the unconditioned source of all things. Likewise, it is a misrepresentation to say that Schleiermacher confined religion to the individual at the cost of the ethical commitment to the neighbor. Even though he maintained that religion is intimately linked to intuition, both his political and his theological writings show that he understood intuition as always already interwoven with history, language, and culture. This conviction is also reflected in his persistent claim that Christian life is always shared and embodied in concrete communities. Now, to summarize this historical excursion into early pietist and romantic forms of Protestantism, my aim has been to highlight the richness and radicality of this specific strand of Lutheran theological anthropology. In particular, I have tried to indicate how Luther, in emphasizing the constitutive role of experience in theological knowing, paved the way for a more compound anthropology that sought to safeguard the complexity of the human subject in a time of growing epistemological reductionism. Moreover, I have tried to show how thinkers like Franke, Baumgarten, and Schleiermacher reappraised both art and religion by restoring them to the intuitive and effective dimension of our interaction with the world. Now, in what remains of this lecture, I shall argue that a renewed focus on the experiential level of the human encounter with the world may provide us with significant keys to reflect anew on what ultimately binds us together as humans, including the political power that lies in this idea. Now, let me return to where I started out, to Agneta's touching letter and to my claim that we need to take testimonies like hers seriously. As you may remember, Agneta described how she was overwhelmed and lifted up by the beauty of the Mona Lisa, Beethoven, or the poetical lyrics of Leonard Cohen, while the standard sermon in a regular church service simply left her cold. The same tendency was also captured by the novelist Birgitta Trotzig in her observation of the discrepancy between people's attendance in regular services and their turnout at concerts of sacred music. And to be sure, 25 years later, her observation still holds. While church attendance continues to fall, even the largest cathedrals are filled when Bach's Passions or Mozart's Requiem are performed. Now, what does it mean to take, or what would it mean to take observations and testimonies like these seriously? One way of doing so, I want to propose, is to renew the focus on experience, which has always been a core concern of liberal theology. Now, as I indicated several times, this is not uncontroversial. Ever since the so-called cultural linguistic turn of anthropology, the idea of universal religious or spiritual experiences has been highly contested. Let me therefore clarify that I'm not suggesting that we should return to the idea of universal human experiences in a naive sense. There is, of course, no such thing as a basic human experience of the holy or the numinous, which is identical to humans across the globe. And history knows too many examples of colonial projections of the experience of one particular culture, notably the Western, upon all humanity. However, having recognized the contingent nature of all human experience, I nonetheless want to argue that a renewed focus on particular experiences in their various expressions and phenomenality may be helpful to enhance mutual cultural understanding, whereas an exaggerated cultural linguistic approach tends to lock people up in specific categories or identities which exclude any claim to shared experiences. Thus you will hear claims such as, well, you can never understand my experience of God's love since you're not a believer, or you can never understand my pain as a woman because you don't know what it means to have a female body, and so on. Well, of course, we can never fully understand another human being's particular experience of God, of pain, of sorrow, or of beauty. But this does not mean that we cannot understand anything of one another's experiences or of the other's experience. On the contrary, although we remain profoundly shaped by culture and language, it is ultimately our ability to recognize agony, sadness, or bliss in another person's face that makes us the complex beings we are, capable of imagination, empathy, and compassion. This is also where I think we have a lot to learn from early aesthetic Protestant theology. Instead of just accepting the premise that we are trapped in our cultural linguistic cages, thinkers like Franke, Baumgarten, and Schleiermacher invite us to focus on the phenomenality of various types of experience before essentializing them into given categories, such as religion and art, or sacred and secular, or Christian and Muslim, and so on. This is not to say that any of these categories are unimportant, nor is it to say that one experience could be reduced to the other, or that complex experiences could be distilled down to more fundamental, pure experiences or raw experiences. On the contrary, what makes an experience in the more compound sense is precisely the specific interpretative framework in which it is inserted, which is also why a Christian person's experience of a Bach concert as a revelatory moment is certainly not identical to an agnostic person's artistic experience of the same concert, and vice versa. The point I'm making, though, is that there are still enough common features in the two forms of experience to enable one person to enhance their understanding of the other's experience and hopefully get a deeper sense for the other's perspective. Now, returning to Agneta's testimony, I think that Christian theologians as well as church representatives may have significant things to learn from these observations. More precisely, such a renewed focus on experience invites us to take on Trotzig's challenge and ponder what it means that many people, including Agneta, feel more at home with Bach or Mozart than with the standard sermon. And I remind you again here of Trotzig's words, and you also have a glimpse of Lund Cathedral, the cathedral of my hometown, which also incidentally was where Birgitta Trotzig resided. Now, taking in this and pondering her therapist's provocative words is not about colonizing people's experiences by suggesting to people that they are actually experiencing the sacred or God, even when they wouldn't want to use these terms themselves. Rather, it is about cultivating a more humble and open-ended attitude on the part of theologians and the clergy. For all our doctrinal and liturgical training, perhaps we, and I of course include myself in this we, need to learn to be less sure about what the sacred really is and where God chooses to reveal God's self. And perhaps we need to relearn with the early pietist theologians to appreciate beauty as one of the means by which God communicates with human beings. Now, as I'm now approaching the end of this lecture, some of you may be asking where the radicality of my proposal lies, since I am talking in the subtitle of Retrieving a Radical Impulse of Aesthetic Protestantism. Isn't what I'm saying just liberal theology at its worst, a boiling down of whatever radicality Christianity contains to a nice message about beauty and pleasurable aesthetic experiences? Well, I think that such attitudes, which I come across sometimes, say more about our tragical loss of esteem for beauty than about any of the vices or virtues of liberal theology. Let me therefore end by saying something about the radicality of beauty. As Elaine Scarry shows in her important book On Beauty and Being Just, throughout history, from Plato to Augustine and on to Dante and the Renaissance thinkers, appreciation of beauty has been intimately linked to our sense for truth and justice. This was also the case among the early modern thinkers I have revisited in this lecture. For the Pietist theologians of Haar, the reflection on beauty was closely associated with the idea of moral education, cultura animi, as part of the overall perfection of God and the universe. According to this view, the affections aroused by beauty in the human soul served as an entry point for moral formation, since it is the affective part of our souls that make us capable of empathy and compassion. Likewise, for the early Romantic thinkers, and for Schleiermacher in particular, their focus on the human capacity to appreciate beauty went hand in hand with an emphasis on moral virtues. As Elaine Scarry observes, it is only in very recent times that we have lost this esteem for beauty as the perhaps most precious feature of creation. Even worse, we have increasingly come to downplay or even deny the significance of beauty. Especially within academic thinking, Scarry discerns a widespread disdain for beauty from the 19th onwards. A common assumption, in particular within the humanities, is that beauty, in the classical sense, diverts us from social concerns and hampers our capacity to attend to problems of injustice. Yet at the same time, there is something hypocritical about this attitude. For as Scarry points out, all the while academic scholars in theory deny the value of beauty and look down at ordinary people's fascination with Mona Lisa or Mozart, they have the privilege to dwell in the world of beauty on an everyday basis. For, as she writes, the humanities are made up of beautiful poems, stories, paintings, sketches, and sculptures, and so on. Now, in sharp contrast to these attitudes, Scarry thinks that ordinary people's spontaneous reactions to beauty have something essential to teach us about the nature and power of beauty. For example, she notes, beauty often arouses an impulse in people to share and give away what they have experienced. When we see or hear something beautiful, we want to draw it, record it, or take a picture of it and perhaps send to a friend or post on social media. It is as if beauty carries a radiating, life-generating power that not only makes us want to share it, but also evokes an impulse to safeguard and protect it. Scarry exemplifies with the way in which we as humans can engage ourselves for beautiful places, buildings, or species whose existence somehow is endangered, even in cases when we know that we may never ourselves be able to see or experience them. One can also think of the collective concern and engagement by people when something beautiful is destroyed. Katarina Church here in Stockholm, and you, of course, are perhaps more well or acquainted with the burning of the Notre Dame and how people felt devastated and the huge commitment and engagement to restore these sites of beauty. Now, this impulse to restore and care for beauty brings Scarry to her main point or her main claim. Contrary to the widely held assumption that beauty distracts us from empathy and justice, Scarry passionately argues that beauty instead intensifies the pressure we feel to repair existing injustices. This is not to deny that beauty can be perverted and used for the most barbaric purposes. History knows ample examples of that. But none of these examples disproves the fact that beauty in itself has the capacity to evoke feelings of care, respect, and wonder that may be extended to a more general concern for any vulnerable thing or being, beautiful or not. And this is also where I would like to end my lecture. Inspired by Scary, I want to suggest that beauty, perhaps more than anything else, has the capacity to bind humans together across cultural, social, and religious boundaries. In a time of rising tribalism, when nationalist actors are pitting Europeans against non-Europeans, Christians against Muslims, our culture against their culture, and so on, I think one of the most radical things we can do is to reclaim a shared world of experiences, and I think that beauty holds a key to this. Heeding to Agneta's letter, but also to the radical impulse of aesthetic Protestantism, it is therefore high time that we start readdressing the possibility of God's wondrous presence in the human capacity of sensuous perception. For as Baumgarten and his pietist peers insisted, beauty may in fact be the original means by which God communicates with human beings and stimulates their will. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maarten van der Bijl and Maria Gutze, for your beautiful contribution and underlining of the lecture, I would say. Now, I would like to turn the floor over to Professor Helene Zorgdrager, who will give a response to Jayne Svenungsson's lecture. Helene Zorgdrager received her doctorate on Schleiermacher and teaches systematic theology and gender studies at the Protestant Theological University in Amsterdam. She is head of the Intercultural Theology and Missiology Chair Group and one of the leaders of the NWO-funded research project Church and Slavery. She's a visiting professor at the Institute of Ecumenical Studies, Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine, where she teaches ecumenical theology. Her research focuses on theology, gender, transgender, sexuality, and sexual diversity, debates and developments in the Netherlands and in Eastern Europe, and on public or political theology. So please, Helene Zorgdrager, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. Well, how to respond to such a balanced, brilliant, beautiful, and bountiful lecture? How to proceed? I gave it quite some thoughts. The worst thing would be now to prioritize the cognitive mind and to analyze the logic of the argument and question concepts that are being used, if I were even able to do so. I'm afraid that would prove that I had missed the whole point of your lecture, dear colleague Jayne. Therefore, I want to take it seriously that to enhance mutual understanding in this fragmented world, we have to expand our understanding of knowledge as including cognitive, sensual, and spiritual capacities of perceiving the world. I chose to let the senses speak first. Which parts of the lecture resonated with me most? Which affected me most, one way or the other? What sparked my imagination and produced unexpected associations? I decided to share these with you, and I present them as 4 reflections, which I connect to 4 key sentences in your lecture. After all, we are systematic theologians. I pick, so to speak, 4 cherries from the cake, following my taste. And there will be plenty of the delicious treat left for further conversation with the audience. In the end is the beginning. I start with the last section, on the power of beauty. The sentence that affected me: it is as if beauty carries a radiating, life-generating power that not only makes us want to share it, but also evokes an impulse to safeguard and protect it. It brings me to Ukraine, the country and the people with which I have a special relation since I started lecturing in Lviv Catholic University in 2005. Since the beginning of the full-scale war, the artistic production in Ukraine exploded. While their world fell into pieces and massive shelling started to ruin cities and villages, artists, both professional and non-professional, started to spill their emotions, griefs and anger onto paper and canvas, into music and songs, into poetry and drama. While human existence is being shattered to its foundations, their creative voices and expressions continue to witness to the pain and despair, as well as to resilience, courage, compassion and hope. Russian military targets museums, drama theaters, schools, universities, cultural and educational centers, as well as monumental buildings such as churches. It is an attempt to destroy the power of culture and the social cohesion of a nation. In this context, the artistic response to the massive destruction is both an impulse to preserve and, in the act of preserving, to help create a new culture. In the words of painter Katarina Lizovenko, I don't want everything to be destroyed again. I don't want what was destroyed to be forgotten. I want the garden country to continue to grow. It was not the first time they came to destroy it. I don't want to forget anything. I am now a moving graveyard. This is my way of preserving what is destroyed around me and in me. Or the arts curator, Olya Balashova. This is the great power of art. War destroys an image, and the artist creates a new one. This image remains intact. The world fell into pieces, scattered into pieces, and we can put it back together. We can put it back together, the world, built on the pillars of mercy, beauty, and human dignity. The image that you see now on the screen is an icon painted on remains of an ammunition box. The ammo box was used by the Ukrainian armed forces in the defense of Bakhmut. The icon is called Our Lady, the life-bringing stream. Life is written on death. Art resists dehumanization. Theology in Ukraine today is practiced in visual art and poetry. Franke and the Frankische Stiftungen in Halle. You appealingly presented his pedagogy based on a rich Lutheran pietistic anthropology. You summarized it in the sentence, experience includes the affective and sensual aspects of our interaction with the world. In the same Naturalienkammer, in the Frankische Stiftungen, also the young Count Nikolaus Ludwig von Zinzendorf, somewhat earlier than Baumgarten, learned to practice sensing God's wondrous presence in the created world. He transmitted the importance of spiritual aesthetic love of nature that transforms it into a symbol of God to the educational institutions of the Moravians, the Herrenhutters. And there, in the boarding school in Niesky, the young boy Friedrich Schleiermacher could admire the mineral collection. He learned botanizing and went with his teachers on excursion in nature. In one of his youthful writings, Die Wasserfahrt, he describes how the contemplation of the river Elbe at night, illuminated by moonlight, awakened his senses for the Creator's presence. He learned to see phenomena of the more than human nature, and then also of his fellow human beings in their uniqueness, in their individuality, as genuine works of art. See his Reden über die Religion, see his Monologen. One could speak of a comprehensive aestheticism in Schleiermacher's early romantic writings. I so much agree with you. Both religion and art require devotion, contemplation, and a childlike passivity in order to be able to see the infinite in the finite. Another pupil of the Frankische Stiftungen was Bartholomäus Ziegenbalg. He and Heinrich Plütschau, also a graduate of Frankes Schule, were the first Protestant missionaries in modern history. They were sent in 1705 by order of the Danish king, who had close relations with August Hermann Francke. They were sent to the colonial settlement of Tranquebar in India. I mention Ziegenbalg here because he approached the Tranquebar people and culture with utmost respect and empathy. He was deeply aware of the significance of learning the language of the other, as a bridge to sharing experiences. From your lecture now, I am tempted to see this as a fruit of his upbringing in the atmosphere of pietism, with its radical impulse of aesthetic contemplation of the outer world that awakens a sense of awe and wonder, and can perceive divine presence in people and cultures that differ from us. Ziegenbalg is honored as the initiator of the intercultural dialogue. Let's return to Schleiermacher, who presented religion and art as two friendly souls. I want to connect to your vision that the radical impulse of aesthetic Protestantism will help us to re-articulate the idea of a shared world, including the claim that there are fundamental human experiences recognizable. How did Schleiermacher re-articulate the idea of a shared world in his time? Therefore, we turn to his views of religious communication, in which art plays a leading role. In his philosophical ethics, he locates art and religion both in the realm of feeling. It is the realm of the more subjective knowing, characterized by individuality, in distinction from the more objective academic knowledge. Feeling finds its completion in religion. Religion, in turn, finds its mode of representation in art. How can the religious feeling be communicated to others? In its particularity, religious feeling is non-transferable. Schleiermacher states, "It is my feeling of being affected by the universe in a unique way. However, in every feeling there is also Gattungsbewusstsein, a sense of common humanity. It shows itself as a tendency, a need to communicate itself. It wants to be shared and recognized by others. The general language is not suitable for that. Religious communication happens primarily in art, in mimics, music, dance, visual arts, architecture, garden art, and in rhetorical, poetical speech, in lebendige Rede, lively speech." In his theology, the Glaubenslehre, we find the same aesthetic approach to religious communication. These are aesthetic categories. Christ is the Urbild, the prototype, and in analogy to the artistic process, believers recreate and reproduce this prototype in a diversity of Nachbildungen, and every Nachbildung strives to communicate itself in artistic expressions. How can individuals, including non-believers, relate to the artistic religious expression of others? This is because the prototype Christ, I'm now taking a shortcut, lives in the fullness of Gemeingeist, the spirit of community, in which he communicates to others without holding back anything. Mind the analogy between the Gattungsbewusstsein and the Gemeingeist. This is how Schleiermacher conceptualizes from a Christian view the possibility of a shared world, in which human beings in their utmost individuality and also in their distinct identity groups are still capable of understanding each other and being affected by the other. Finally, we need to relearn to appreciate beauty as one of the means by which God communicates with human beings. Your plea for rehabilitating an aesthetic spiritual sense for relating to the world reminds me of how two liberal, vrijzinnige female scholars in the Netherlands, they are here, Hans Alma and Hetty Zok, argue for a renewed appreciation of the human capacities of attention, imagination, and connectedness in liberal theology. They understand the term attention in the tradition of Simone Weil and Iris Murdoch as a loving and just seeing of something or someone particular in the outer world. It is a kind of allocentric observation, centering on the other and caring for the other's right to exist. They contend Dutch liberal Protestantism doesn't need to give up its love for scientific, rational analysis. It will not lose anything by making room for awe and wonder. On the contrary, let's reconnect to the more experiential piety, the bevindelijke strand in liberal Protestantism. Today, you strengthened their argument. And you pointed us to even earlier sources, the radical impulse of early Protestantism that waits to further unfold its ecumenical treasures in deeply artistic ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Helene, for your beautiful way, a way of beauty to respond to the lecture of tonight. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Jayne once again to probably or perhaps respond to Helene and answer one or two questions from the audience. We are running out of time, but one or two questions may be possible. So, please.
Well, thank you, dear Helene, and I have to say to turn your argument back and say that after such a generous and beautiful and thoughtful response, I wouldn't want to start to discuss that or destroy it by discussing it intellectually, cognitively. So I want to say a heartfelt thanks for a really, really beautiful expansion of what I felt was important and what I wanted to convey. So thank you so much. If I will pick one single phrase back, which I will keep with me, is the beauty as resistance, and your example from Ukraine. It's profoundly touching, and that is another aspect of beauty, which is scary actually that I didn't touch upon, but which really is further to explore more. And which belongs again to both the power and the radicality of beauty. So thank you so much. And And yes, if there is
Any questions, please ask them, or comments to make, or Wim.
Thank you very much for a fascinating lecture. Maybe on the historical part, I'm working currently on issues about the understanding of Naturalienkabinet, on those curiosities, and natural theology in that context being also, well, serving to justify science as well as to justify theology. But you emphasize very much this experiential side. Would you link that to this collection of Naturalienkabinet, Wunderkammer, the whole search for, well, what we tend to think in terms of early science, but you made it into something else?
But the thing is, that what is fascinating is that it is both. I mean, this is early science and this is early religion. So I have a few comments. Franke, one of the things I've said about him was that you have the stereotype of piety being just emotional enthusiasm and so on, but he was profoundly engaged with scientists of his time and fascinated by him. But I think we need to remind ourselves, and we really have important things to learn here, that this was before this violent science religion distinction existed. So there was this beautiful Swedish distinction that I draw a lot on, a young intellectual historian, Andreas Rydberg, who wrote his dissertation on scientific and spiritual experience precisely, and Frank and Baumgarten are of course in his dissertation, but in this early period. So that's one aspect or one part of my answer. But then also I want to emphasize the way in which the objects, of course, were part of the students' or pupils' scientific training, if you wish, but also fully integrated in their spiritual training to learn to see the marvel of creation. And also, I mean, it's pedagogically interesting because we speak today of object-based learning, and we many hundred years later, now we start to rediscover it. But you can think, I think, also it is kind of early form of object-based learning. So many fascinating aspects in it.
Well, we have the opportunity for one more. Yes, Harry.
Thank you for your fascinating lecture. The stance, the position you developed, should it have consequences for theological training programs? And did it already happen perhaps in Lund, that you have a completely new program that was more practical, engaging in aesthetics and so? Could you comment on that?
Yeah, well, I presume my answer is I wish, but we're very far from Franke's institution in Lund. But I mean, one thing that I've been reflecting on, both going back to Birgitta Trotzi's comment and to this Agneta's letter, is why don't we invest more in homiletics? During the 4 or 5 years of academic training that our ministers to be get, it is as if homiletics, it's something which you kind of, you read about theoretically, again, cognitively, theoretically. There's no, during all this year, contact whatsoever with the fact of the beauty, what is a beautiful sermon, what is rhetorics and so on. So the sad reality is that my utopian dreams vision is very far from, for example, what the training program looks at today. Although I did mention this yesterday at the THU in Amsterdam, I was teaching for many years, and I think you mentioned it briefly, perhaps in the introduction, at Stockholm School of Theology before I returned to Lund. And they're actually, it's a smaller university college run by the Swedish Baptist Church, Methodist Church, and another third church. but also they also train ministers for the Church of Sweden. And given that they are a private school, they have much more of a holistic education with well, the students can train to their preaching work on an everyday basis, and they would get feedback both from art teachers and from well, the biblical scholars and so on. And the students that graduate from that school are normally very good, preachers and so on. So I think it would be. I mean, there are challenges. We could bring in these kinds of reflections, the importance of beauty, back into not just the practical training, but into the academic study of theology and the training of ministers. I would suggest.
Thank you very much, Jayne. We will end here, and of course there's further discussion possible and conversation possible at the drinks later, but we will end here for now, and I would like to thank you very, very much for your lecture and your responses.
And thanks to all of you.
Thank you, Jayne, for lecturing. Thank you, Helene, for responding. Thank you for listening over here in this church and by means of the stream. There is an audience on the stream as well. We thank you for your attention. And I would like to announce the lecture next year. That is the lecture on Friday, 21st of March. Save the date, I would like to say. And of course, I would like to thank the musicians, Maarten and Maria. And I'm really happy to announce to you that they will sing 2 more songs.